The United States isn't going to tolerate a a war with a world war with Russia, and that's what Zelensky's asking for. We can't afford it right now, and the other thing is it could go nuclear that quick. I mean, I'm not, sometimes I think Medvedev is just saying things, but he is the deputy of the National Security Council, former president, former prime minister. He just told the Baltic states, Article 5 doesn't protect you when a Russian nuclear bomb wipes you off the face of the earth. It may kick in, but you won't know it because you'll be dead. You'll be a wet spot on the planet, he said. Now, why is he saying this? Well, because he knows, he knows what Russian nuclear doctrine is. He knows what will happen if NATO goes to war, if the Baltics were able to, ever dared act out what they claim. We will be the initial strike against Russia and any NATO. You'll disappear instantly. It doesn't take much to remove Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia from the face of the earth. This is the stupidity. And yet in the West, Russia's bluffing, Russia's bluffing, Russia's bluffing. Well, you can say that until Russia isn't bluffing. Then it's too late. Is it really worth the risk? Is it really worth the call, the call bluff on this one?
Scott Ritter's stark warning about the dangers of escalating the Ukraine conflict into a global war highlights a grim reality that the West may not fully grasp. His analysis cuts through the layers of optimism and strategic posturing that dominate Western political discourse. For years, many in the U.S. and NATO leadership have downplayed the seriousness of Russia's nuclear posture, dismissing it as mere saber-rattling or bluffing. But Ritter is sounding the alarm. The stakes are too high to gamble on that assumption. At the heart of Ritter's warning is the very real possibility of nuclear escalation. This isn't hyperbole. This is rooted in the hard facts of Russian nuclear doctrine. Russia's strategic policy does not mirror that of the United States or NATO when it comes to nuclear deterrence. For Russia, if the existence of the state is threatened, the use of nuclear weapons becomes a real option. And in this case, Ritter underscores Medvedev's comments as a wake-up call. Russia isn't bluffing when it comes to defending its core interests. To fully understand the weight of Ritter's argument, we must explore the NATO-Russia standoff, particularly in the context of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These small nations, bordering Russia, have been at the center of NATO's eastern expansion, a policy that Moscow has consistently viewed as an existential threat. For years, NATO has assured its Baltic members that Article 5, the alliance's mutual defense clause, would protect them in the event of Russian aggression. But Ritter challenges this assumption. He raises the chilling question: what happens when Russia calls NATO's bluff? Medvedev's remarks about a nuclear strike wiping the Baltic states off the map are not just bluster. They reflect the stark reality of the region's vulnerability. In a full-scale war between NATO and Russia, these nations could be annihilated in minutes, long before any Article 5 response could be coordinated. The West may not want to believe this, but as Ritter points out, Russia isn't interested in playing games. For years, Western analysts and politicians have underestimated Russia's resolve. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, the intervention in Syria, and now the war in Ukraine all show that Russia is willing to use force when it feels its vital interests are threatened. And yet, despite these precedents, the West continues to misread Moscow's intentions. In the case of Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies encouraged Ukraine to resist Russian influence, while steadily increasing military aid and support, even as it became clear that this was pushing the region toward conflict. Ritter points out that the current situation with President Zelensky is a prime example of this dangerous escalation. Zelensky, in his appeals for Western military aid, is effectively asking for World War III. He's calling for the U.S. and NATO to directly confront Russia, a nuclear power, in a conflict that could rapidly spiral out of control. But, as Ritter emphasizes, the U.S. cannot afford this war. Economically, militarily, and politically, the costs are simply too high. And most importantly, the risk of nuclear war is very real. To fully appreciate Ritter's concerns, it's essential to understand Russian nuclear doctrine. Unlike the U.S., which maintains a policy of nuclear deterrence aimed primarily at preventing a first strike, Russia's doctrine allows for first use of nuclear weapons in certain situations. Specifically, if Russia perceives an existential threat to the state, whether from conventional or nuclear forces, it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons. This includes the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons in a regional conflict, like one involving the Baltics. This is why Ritter's mention of the Baltic states is so crucial. These small countries, despite being members of NATO, are highly vulnerable in any conflict with Russia. Geographically, they are right on Russia's doorstep, and militarily, they would be overwhelmed in a matter of hours. As Ritter notes, Russia could remove these nations from the map with just a few tactical strikes. And once that happens, NATO's Article 5 response would be too late. The Baltic states would already be gone. Ritter's critique of NATO's defense posture in Eastern Europe points to a broader problem: the illusion of security. While NATO leaders talk about defending every inch of alliance territory, the reality is that the organization is not prepared for a full-scale war with Russia, especially one that involves nuclear weapons. The Baltic states, in particular, are caught in a precarious position. They rely on NATO's assurances, but as Ritter suggests, those assurances might prove meaningless in the face of a rapid, overwhelming Russian strike. What's even more concerning is that Western leaders seem willing to call Russia's bluff, believing that Moscow would never actually use nuclear weapons. This is a dangerous miscalculation. As Ritter points out, Russia is not bluffing when it comes to its nuclear arsenal. Medvedev's recent comments serve as a clear reminder of that. If NATO pushes too far, if the West continues to provoke Russia with military exercises, troop deployments, and political pressure, we could find ourselves on the brink of a nuclear exchange. And once that threshold is crossed, it's too late to turn back. As Ritter warns, is it really worth the risk? Ritter's speech also highlights the fragile state of U.S.-Russia relations. Decades of diplomacy and arms control agreements, designed to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict, have been undermined by recent events. The withdrawal from treaties like the INF Treaty and the deterioration of dialogue between Washington and Moscow have left the two nations in a state of heightened tension. In this volatile environment, even a small miscalculation, a border incident, a military accident, or a misunderstanding during a military exercise could escalate into a full-scale conflict. The U.S. and Russia are no longer talking, and without communication channels, the risk of an unintended war is higher than ever. Ultimately, Ritter's message is one of urgency. The West must face the reality of the situation. Continuing to escalate the conflict with Russia, whether in Ukraine or the Baltics, is a recipe for disaster. The U.S. and NATO cannot afford a war with Russia, economically, politically, or militarily. But more importantly, the risk of nuclear war is too great to ignore. As Ritter warns, we can't afford to call Russia's bluff any longer. The stakes are too high, and the consequences too dire. The U.S. and NATO must step back from the brink, engage in diplomacy, and find a way to de-escalate the tensions before it's too late. According to Scott Ritter, the United States isn't going to tolerate a world war with Russia. And that's exactly what Zelensky is asking for. We can't afford it right now. The other thing is, it could go nuclear that quick. I mean, sometimes I think people believe it's just rhetoric, but when you've got Medvedev, he's not just anyone. He's the deputy of the National Security Council, a former president, a former prime minister of Russia. He's telling the Baltic states that Article 5 won't protect you when a Russian nuclear bomb wipes you off the face of the earth. Sure, it may kick in, but you won't know it. You'll be dead, just a wet spot on the planet. He said that. Now, why is he saying this? Because he knows what Russian nuclear doctrine is, and he knows what will happen if NATO goes to war. If the Baltics were to act out what they claim and launch any kind of strike against Russia, they'd disappear instantly. It doesn't take much to remove Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia from the face of the earth. This is the stupidity we're dealing with, and yet in the West, we keep hearing that Russia is bluffing. Well, you can say that, but what happens when Russia isn't bluffing? When it's too late to find out? Is it really worth the risk to call that bluff? Thanks for watching.